rather than the guilt shaming that we see happening, that's the story that they're trying to tell. Greedy property investors owning 5, 6, 7 of these particular properties, locking us out of being able to afford property. We could make a very strong case the property market, in terms of the way in which the laws are set up, the tax laws in this country, actually prefer owner-occupiers. So the preferences in terms of the benefits from our current tax system benefits the owner-occupiers significantly more than any other type of residential property buyer. So remember, owner-occupiers drive the price. They drive the price, not the other way around. Like, investor should be a price taker, not a price maker. And the reason why the Great Australian Dream and buying property is so attractive is because there is an expectation that the value of that property will continue to grow. And that's all off the back of the way in which the mechanics of the economics work, because they're the rules of the game.
Now, the mum and dad narrative isn't working. There's no cut through on that, Ben. And the reason the mum and dad narrative happens is because it's largely, for a lot of property investors, based on stats. Most people stop at one, Ben. So it becomes this passive investment scenario. And it's mum and dads who may or may not have any detailed level of business sophistication. I mean that with respect, Ben. But they're getting on with their life, and they're just putting in our suggestion, 1 or 2 investment properties. It's just this passive set and forget structure, which leads to the mum and dad property investor. It doesn't have any cut through to distinguish. On one hand, we're saying over here, but on the other hand, you're seeing them as, people just with, a bunch of cash with extraordinary excess and extraordinary rules working against them. The majority of property investors, Ben, are at the very best just breaking even for a long period of time. And for, as we talked a lot on this podcast, they're usually in a negative cash flow position until they move to that point. So that narrative just doesn't have the cut through, Ben, which is why we want to change it.
We want tenants to have safe and quiet enjoyment. Like, we want our tenants to be happy tenants as part of that. Now, there'll always be outliers in terms of, there will be people who think that ownership gives them the ultimate rights in terms of how they can treat their customers. That shouldn't be the case. And I can understand why we've got to make sure that isn't the case. So there's just a lot of reasons why people choose to rent. And that's by choice, not necessarily by necessity. So part of that story is that people understand that actually they are small businesses, and actually they do inject tens of billions of dollars into the economy. In fact, I think I've mentioned this several times on the pod over, the many years that we've been running it. But NAB economist once said, for $1 that goes into property, residential property, that is, $10 is created in terms of economic benefit through the subsequent tradies and builders and all of those sort of pieces. And also remembering, in some states, it's upwards of 40% to 53% of all taxes that the state governments and the federal governments get are priced into that. So ultimately, they are also paying their way in terms of the taxes and charges that they're already paying. So what we're trying to do in Shift the Narrative is really just around sort of saying, rather than us being the problem, what you've got to be thinking about is if investors keep investing, that creates that additional supply. So make us part of the solution, and make sure you give us confidence to want to be part of that solution, rather than the lack of confidence that we might get through, the risk of policy changes, which really disrupt our ability to make a return on investment. And ultimately, we're going to find ourselves in a far more severe position than we currently already find ourselves in this current, housing crisis.
Viewing your properties as business assets encourages those data-driven decisions. When do I rent? When do I adjust my rent? In some cases, do I need to divest? Or in other cases, do I need to add to the portfolio? So the same thing applies to small business owners in terms of managing those assets, Ben. So folks, we didn't provide an exhaustive list, but the idea was to just go, okay, mum and dad property investor narrative, how do we bring that narrative over to small business owners? So we talked about how managing assets like a business, we've got to look into income generation, strategic planning, risk management and contingency planning, understanding and managing liabilities. We talked about customer relationship management. Ben talked about the relationship around employing different people, and then we just finished it off there with marketing branding. So Ben, that is by no means an exhaustive
No.
list of the comparisons. So ultimately, Ben, if we get this narrative right and we change it from mum and dad investor to small business owner, ultimately the tenant does win.
They win, Bryce. And again, if you grow the economic pie rather than changing or increasing taxes or minimum compliance standards, which is cost, which ultimately gets passed on the tenant. If you actually increase the volume, which is more supply, the government, back to your point, gets those higher tax receipts. And guess what they could do with those higher tax receipts? They could provide increased levels of social and public housing so they can have that safety net for those most vulnerable in the community. If that other bit doesn't happen and they still have to provide that safety net, we go broke. And ultimately, everyone starts paying higher taxes. And ultimately, that economic flywheel of wealth creation and that repurpose and that spending of that wealth back into the economy increases our overall living standards and allows us to provide the education, health, and all of the services that we are so lucky to have in this country. But if you tax everyone too high, you'll see everyone trying to dodge those taxes, trying to move their money offshore, do all of these other silly things when we need all of that money to stay put here to look after those. So I think, when someone talks to you about the property market and certainly private rental accommodation, and if you're running that business, say I'm a small business owner is the message here, because that's exactly what you are.
Well said, mate. So do we now officially change the title of our book, Ben, The Armchair Guide to Small Business Ownership, How to Retire in 2008?
Yeah, maybe.
Probably doesn't get the same...
No, it's a bit of a long title, isn't it? Yeah.
Get the same
maybe
hook,
not.
does it? But essentially, that's what we're doing.